50,000 miles by outboard motor. Filmed by the Kiekhaefer Corporation at Lake X in Central Florida, a project which was to excite every family that dreams about the fun and freedom of owning a boat and motor. For this was to be the site of a test of modern outboard motors unmatched in motorboating history, and was to be the most dramatic proof yet of the progress made since the day in 1905 when C.B. Waterman brought out the first mass-produced outboard. It was a safety test of dependability, which was almost unbelievable to these engineers and test drivers in those last hours before it got underway. If successful, it would show the safety of modern outboards for extended family cruising. A 50,000-mile cruise was the target. A distance twice around the world, and at normal motor cruising speeds, they would make it in less than the conventional 80 days for some once-around-the-world trips. An oval course, 5.5 miles around, had been surveyed on the lake. No fair weather journey, they would be running night and day. The buoys were the markers with lights to guide them in the dark. A final check by a crew chief of the lights, and soon the quiet lake would take on new life. If their plans were right, they would be finished by Christmas. The only contact with the outside world was a mobile telephone. All in readiness, they called for final instructions and clearance. The official observers of the United States Auto Club were in the timing booth, checking their electronic equipment, and for the first time in the outboard industry, there would be an official certification to protect the public and prove modern outboard safety. The boats were already on the lake, preparing for the start as the fuel truck came in with gasoline they would need later as the run wore on. 2 5-place family runabouts, each powered by a 60-horsepower Mercury 6-cylinder Mark 75, would make the run. The motors were stock models chosen at random by the USAC from production. With only normal service, they must go the entire distance with a complete teardown and reassembly at the 25,000-mile point and at the end of the run by USAC. The test was on. Boat number 1, by the timing booth, running smoothly and effortlessly. The grueling journey was underway. It was 7 a.m., September the 11th. And 3 minutes later, boat number 2. The drivers instructed to keep this time interval during the thousands of laps ahead of them. These were the motors, and these the engineers and test drivers who were out to show that after 52 years, the outboard had come of age, that it was safe, that families could now trust their outboards. This way, any family could open the door to water skiing, fishing, to skin diving in distant waters, and best of all, to cruising to far-off places on the nation's tens of thousands of miles of water highways. That meant slow down 100 revolutions per minute, and the driver checks the tachometer on his dashboard. After a while, the drivers got so they could make lap after lap with almost no variation at all in time. Hour after hour through the day and night. Through good weather and bad, 5-foot waves, heavy fog, tropical storms. This instruction sign from the ever-watchful crew chiefs meant, take it easy, the water's getting rougher. Of course, it made little difference to the motor, but it made a great difference to the drivers, because then the pounding would start, and at these modern cruising speeds, it got somewhat rough after 10 or 12 hours. But the trees and water were sometimes as quiet as the motors. The drivers were so used to it, they hardly noticed the sharp contrast between their sleek modern boats and motors and the age-old timelessness of the lake and its shore. There were other times when the rain so shrouded the cypress trees and their Spanish moss that it was almost impossible to see them 50 yards away. On went the foul weather gear and the caps were pulled down, for the run could not stop, rain or shine, day or night. Once considered as a way to pass instructions to the drivers, a helicopter became much more useful in making the photographic record of the long-distance cruise. And the run went on. The boats were refueled and drivers changed every 4 hours. With a 30-gallon tank, each boat carried an average of 100 pounds of extra fuel as a reserve in the event the weather prevented refueling at the regular times. This told the drivers something else beside that it was time to refuel. It was also the end of their stretch of driving. Using a system which was a marine version of the air refueling of jet planes, the crew ran their fueling boat alongside the endurance boat, matching its speed so that no time would be lost while the fueling was going on. The relief driver hopped aboard the endurance boat, got his instructions on tachometer RPMs. The driver going off duty then had the job of refueling. While the endurance run was a normal cruise in all respects, the matter of fueling with no spillage or fire hazard had to be worked out ahead of time. A transparent vent hose from a 50-gallon drum mounted about 5 feet off the deck of the fuel boat was connected to the hose in the test boat. This gravity feed procedure kept refueling time down to a minimum. The overflow showing in the hose was the signal to disconnect. The plug was replaced and the two boats drew apart. Unleaded Amoco gasoline was used, pre-mixed with Kiekhaefer quicksilver outboard oil on a 20-to-1 ratio. Taking boat number 2 first, the refueling boat then moved on to number 1 boat, and the procedure was repeated with the new driver first taking over and getting instructions, and the man relieved handling the refueling. The drivers worked 4 hours on and 8 hours off. The service group worked 12-hour shifts. The motors each used about 3 8/10 gallons per hour and averaged 7 9/10 miles per gallon for the first half of the endurance run. United States Auto Club officials worked round the clock on 8-hour shifts in the timer's booth jutting out into the lake. Modern electronic timing and computing devices were used as each boat's time and lap were registered as it passed. All incidents were registered in the official records, including amounts of fuel, times of spark plug and distributor point changes, and other activities, such as changing a headlight when one burned out. Try this lying flat on the bow of a boat someday. But for these men, it was all part of the important job of making the run come to a successful conclusion. The service boat had special handles for obvious reasons, one of many precautions taken for the safety of the crew. Now it was getting dark on the evening of October 15th. The men were beginning to get pretty excited, even for engineers, for the boats were very close to the end of the first half of the 50,000-mile test. It was 6:45 in the evening, 34 1/2 days and nights after the confident start of the ordeal for the motors. Now headlights splitting the darkness, boat number 1. And 3 minutes later, boat number 2 finished 25,000 miles, equal to the distance around the world. Flagged in by USAC steward Charlie McDonald, who told them later, "I've seen a lot of automobile endurance runs, and the fact that not one but both boats finished the run and in the same lap is highly unusual." The two boats with their 60 horsepower motors were to be inspected by USAC from top to bottom and inside and out before they would be allowed by the officials to proceed with the run. In going the first 25,000 miles, they had already exceeded all existing official and unofficial endurance records against elapsed time, and the United States Auto Club had officiated the entire time. Finally, the crew's enthusiasm came out, and into the water went one of the crew chiefs. In the traditional dunking they all knew meant success to each one of them personally. TV star Tommy Bartlett congratulates the man who planned the whole trip, Carl Kiekhaefer, Mercury president. His comment, "The record of 34 1/2 days and nights for the first 25,000-mile run constitutes proof of outboard motor performance and durability and gives us the type of information that has been sadly lacking in the boating industry, since no other manufacturer has undertaken such a test and brought it to a successful conclusion. It means families can have confidence in the modern super-powered high-thrust outboard motors for boating on open water. But we know the motors have even greater dependability, and we're going to prove it as soon as the teardown of the engines, inspection and reassembly under USAC supervision is completed." USAC steward McDonald and his assistants impounded the engines that night, sealing them until they could be inspected the next day. Still under USAC orders, the motors were loaded for transport to the inspection location at Sarasota. Stopping en route, he chose another 60 horsepower Mercury at random from a dealer's inventory to use as a comparison with the two endurance motors in order to make certain their parts are within standard production specifications. At the Mercury Proving Ground at Sarasota, McDonald would closely supervise the disassembly of the two engines with the help of one of his USAC assistants. The motors were removed and set on stands. The seals and tags had not been tampered with. Breaking his own seal, he began the inspection. Since USAC chose the original engines from production, he did not expect to find any differences from the comparison stock engine. But the function of USAC in tests of this kind is to carry out a rigid inspection before it will certify that the statistics of the test can be published to the public as official facts instead of unofficial claims. The estimate is that the run thus far had been the equivalent of 10 years of normal motor use. It was the first certified test by any company in the industry of an outboard's general performance capabilities. Put to the severest trials were the outboard's electrical system, the battery, the tachometer and aquameter, electrical windshield wipers, the ride guide steering, remote controls, lubricants, spark plugs, clamp brackets, engine mounts, gear train, and propeller slip clutch. There had been no mechanical or electrical failure. The batteries were still fully charged at the end of the run. Lower units required no grease at all. Low piston speeds resulting from the engine's short-stroke design caused only imperceptible wear on piston rings. Light, reciprocated parts held engine stresses to an extremely low point. The built-in generator on each motor maintained sufficient power for the electrical load. 2 auto headlights, 4 running lights, and dash lights were used. Days later, and with the engines in pieces, McDonald gave the traditional sign of approval. They're okay. They meet stock production specifications. The results of the first 25,000-mile run were now official. Director of Competition for the U.S. Auto Club, Dwayne Carter, announces the endurance feat to the nation's press and credits Kiekhaefer with again taking the lead in the boating industry in showing the public what modern engineering has done to make outboards safe and dependable, and signs the official certifications for both motors along with McDonald. 25,003 3/10 miles in 34 days, 11 hours, 43 minutes, 45 seconds at 30 2/10 miles per hour. Now reassembled under USAC's supervision, the outboards were unveiled for the editors. Soon, with new boats, the same 2 motors would go back to Lake X to continue the test and prove beyond the last remaining doubt that the modern safety-engineered outboards deserve the confidence and respect of present and future boating fans. For the second half of the run, new boats were brought in as an additional safety measure as rougher water and bad weather were anticipated. The 2 25,000-mile motors were rigged on the new 17-foot runabouts for the next leg of the cruise. The USAC directed reassembly with no parts required or replaced. At Lake X, final preparations were made, batteries installed, the same single-lever remote controls and ride guide steering that had already gone the 25,000 miles were installed. Headlights were adjusted because the run would go on night and day. This was an endurance test, not only for the engines and their parts, but also for all the controls, the accessories, and the electrical system. It was 10 a.m. on November 20th when all was in readiness and Charlie McDonald flagged them toward their target for the second phase of the endurance run. Another 25,000 miles for a total of 50,000 miles. A test of outboard motors unheard of in the boating industry and never successfully tried on a supervised official basis before Carl Kiekhaefer put his Mercury outboards to the task. The 2 60-horsepower Mercury Mark 75s were off again, running smoothly and powerfully around the surveyed course on the Florida Lake. Refueling again would be carried out on the fly, with the fuel boat pulling up close beside the endurance boat as it continued around the prescribed course. First, the new driver took over the wheel, and then the man going off duty handled the fuel hoses, which connected into the hose on the runabout. This happened every 4 hours during the day and night. The refueling procedure was so well worked out that the darkness made little difference to the crew. The boats were fueled in succession and proceeded onward, for it was a continuous test as they ran against elapsed time, including pit stops designated in the official records. Distributor points were run up to 17,000 miles without adjustment, and the AC spark plug sets were changed as a precautionary safety measure about every 7,000 miles, although regapping probably would have extended the useful plug life to over 10,000 miles. All servicing was under the complete surveillance of the USAC officials, of course. In addition to the normal hazards of night operation, many unusual obstructions confronted the drivers. Alert crew chiefs on several occasions had spotted an 8-foot alligator cruising slowly on the surface. For the official log, one morning a driver reported, "Sighted gator dead ahead. No time to take evasive action. Felt solid thump. No damage to boat or motor. Damage to alligator unknown." Between shifts, the crew used a large house trailer right at the Lake X base, for on an engineering project like this, the men must be thinking about the project even while they eat and sleep to anticipate any emergency and be ready for it. Rugged individualists, every driver and the crew chiefs had been carefully trained for the job. Weather was the chief hazard. The boats were sometimes minutes apart, other times only seconds, and the officials watched them constantly as they also kept close check on wind and ever-threatening weather. The temperature ranged from 26 to 90 degrees. Wind gusts were up to 40 miles per hour. Waves went to 7 feet on the small lake. Rain and heavy fog sometimes reduced speeds to as low as 10 miles per hour. The second phase was by far the most severe because of the high frequency of squalls, storms, and heavy seas. To these were added a 24-hour-a-day hazard from hyacinths, with 2 or 3 acre islands of them sometimes moving with every wind change. But there was time for the men to relax, too, perhaps trying to catch armadillos with their bare hands, other times fishing for bass in the Endurance Lake. The run went on, and the motors showed no signs of faltering. Still close together and still in the same lap, the 50,000-mile Mark 75s were nearly at the end of the second part of their ordeal. Charlie McDonald of USAC gave them the sign, and there were only 2 more laps. The run already was estimated to be the equivalent of a lifetime of use by an average boat owner, and in wear and tear, to be equal to that for an automobile's engine in 150,000 miles on the highway. Each 25,000-mile run had started out to be 40-day projects, but the smoothness of operation and trouble-free performance of the motors had brought both to an earlier conclusion. Now all were on the pier. It was 5:03 on Christmas Eve, December 24th. McDonald's checkered finish flag was ready. The first boat was in with a total of 68 days, 18 hours, 51 minutes, 4/10 seconds elapsed time. The other boat was right behind, finishing with a total only 4 8/10 seconds longer. It was 50,000 miles in 1,650 8/10 hours, averaging 30 3/10 miles per hour, equaling the distance twice around the world. The run exceeded all known tests for marine engines of any type for total distance against elapsed time, and of course exceeded any previous outboard motor tests for total hours of operation. Behind the success of the run was Carl Kiekhaefer, who said, "This certainly proves that Mercury outboards offer dependable and safe propulsion for family boating with the greatest safety factor. This run confirms our decision many years ago to go to small bore, short stroke inline engines rather than big bore twins, V-twins, V4s, or even 3-cylinder inline and radial engines, all of which we had tested and evaluated years before engines of these types appeared on the market. Our selection of the 4 inline and 6 inline engine designs was deliberate. We had our choice. There is no question in our minds that with proper care and maintenance, any production Mark 75 or Mark 78 is capable of 100,000 boat miles." Kiekhaefer congratulates the men who spent hours as drivers and crew chiefs in this amazing endurance test. This is one of the motors, propeller and skeg intact except for nicks from hitting floating logs, blackened, grimy, and scratched, but mechanically as good as new. And so ends the first certified endurance test in the outboard industry. The motors had gone farther and in a shorter time than any other marine power plant in history. Not a speed test, but an engineering project. It was positive proof that Mercury outboards are safe and dependable for extended family cruising. Here is final acknowledgement that the outboard is the key to family fun. With a modern outboard, the families play together on the water in the safety and comfort and confidence that the Mercury endurance test has given them. Inspection over, USAC steward McDonald gives the OK sign. The 50,000-mile run is official.